Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's my pleasure to welcome to the studio today an old friend of mine. We're going to be talking about a very interesting subject, something looking in Minnesota's past about the creation of the state's first national forest, the Minnesota National Forest. Our guest today is Newell Searle, who is an author, historian. We're going to be talking about Minnesota's conservation legacy and how the Minnesota National Forest came to be. Welcome to Access to Democracy, Newell.
Well, thank you, Steve. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So, you don't originally have Minnesota roots. You came by way of your parents moving to Minnesota from the East Coast, right? From New Jersey. Tell us just briefly how your family ended up in Minnesota.
Well, my father, after the war, World War II, my father really wanted out of the industrial East and had an opportunity to go farming in Minnesota with my uncle. And so neither of them had ever had any experience in farming. But when you're 27 years old, you can do anything, and including writing an article. And so my parents packed us up in the 1940 Plymouth, and we came out here in April of 1947.
And you were telling me before the show that you actually remember arriving here as a young person of all of the age of 3.
Yep, I remember the day we arrived. It was raining, it was gray, and there was mud everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And your family settled on a farm in southern Minnesota in Waseca County, growing crops and tending to livestock. And
we had just about a little bit of everything starting out. We had sheep, we had goats, we had geese, we had cows, pigs, chickens. Over time, we thinned that out to cattle and chickens and corn and soybeans, and some of the other crops we were growing, we let those go because there's no market for them.
So we should mention, your name may be known in some political circles because of your father. Tell us what he ended up doing.
Well, after 7 years in Minnesota, he was talked into running for the state legislature. And he was very active. He was a very outgoing man, an extrovert. And
his name was Rod Searle.
His name was Rod Searle, and he was in the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, the Red Cross, the Toastmasters, the Kiwanis, you name it. He belonged to it. And he ran. And he lost the primary by 90-odd votes, and he turned around and continued running and won the next election in 1956.
And then kept getting reelected.
Well, he was better than that. He got reelected. 6 of the 12 terms were uncontested. And he finished his term in 79-80 as Speaker of the House in 1979 when the House was divided 67-67.
So he was a compromise candidate elected by both the DFLers and the Republicans at that time.
Compromise was his middle name.
Yeah.
And that's how he got things done.
So would it be fair to say that your father's background and career maybe influenced you a little bit, your own interest in public policy? Because you and I have worked together as advocates when I worked in the nonprofit sector, and we worked on hunger and nutrition issues together. Was your dad's career part of the influence that led you in that direction?
Probably.
Yeah.
He was elected a legislator at a time when the legislature was nonpartisan.
Right. They were known as conservatives and liberals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were. That's what they called themselves.
Right.
But they were all pretty much one big family.
Yeah.
For the most part, and so there were no hard and fast divisions. So it was much easier to compromise, and you learn a lot just by watching and seeing how it's done. So yeah, that was
influenced you.
That was influenced me. Sure.
So let's jump ahead. We're going to jump up to the year 1971. What are you doing in 1971, Newell?
I'm a graduate student working on a doctorate, and also working part-time as for the director of the Minnesota Historical Society,
Russell Fridley.
And he had need of a research associate to look up stuff for talks that he was giving, because he was very good at talking to legislators, making presentations, building support for the Historical Society, which became the Minnesota History Center. And so my job was to dig into the papers and archives at the Minnesota Historical Society and look up stuff, and including the background of the construction of the Minnesota State Capitol building, which was a fascinating story. And in this case, I started looking into the history of the Federation of Women's Clubs in Minnesota, and along the way discovered that they were involved in a conservation issue, which became this article.
Was this a surprising discovery to you? By the way, before you answer that, let me just say real quickly, you wrote a paper called The Minnesota National Forest, The Politics of Compromise, 1898 to 1908. You won an award for this paper, the Theodore Blagan Award. And you later wrote a book called Saving Quetico Superior, A Land Set Apart. So back to that question, though, were you a little bit surprised to find out that this women's group had such an important, impactful role in the creation of the Minnesota National Forest?
Yeah, the women were involved in something I hadn't expected. And once I saw that, I thought, well, let's see where this goes. And so I gave Russell Fridley the information he was looking for, and he had no further interest in the Women's Federation as an issue. But then along the way, I saw that it connected to Christopher C. Andrews, who was became Minnesota's Forestry Commissioner, and Herbert Haupt Chapman, who became later the director of the Forestry School at Yale. Among other things on our farm, we happened to be tree farmers as well, and I had hung around a retired forester for much of my young life. So this subject interested me personally, and the more I got into it, the more interesting and complicated it became.
So this term, we hear the term conservation and describing people as conservationists. In your paper, you have a sentence which says, conservation originated in efforts to promote the efficient development and use of all natural resources through rational planning. Would it be fair to say that in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was a somewhat different understanding of what it meant to be a conservationist than might be the case today, where it's more about restricting the extraction of natural resources, then it was about mixed use, so to speak, about extraction, but also about managing and preserving, in this case, forest land.
Yeah, the origin of conservation, I mean, the word and the practices, like many, start out being largely undefined. It's a general idea, and making conservative use, conservation is conservative use of a resource. Part of the backstory is that Christopher C. Andrews, who had been would come to Minnesota as a young lawyer in the 1850s to kind of see what the world had to offer him,
Came from Vermont.
Came
right?
from
New
Vermont,
England.
yeah. And the Civil War came, he enlisted, he rose from private to general in the course of the war. And after the war, when he lost a race for Congress, President Grant appointed him the U.S. ambassador to Sweden. And it was during his 8 years in Sweden that he observed Swedish forestry and how they managed their forests. And he actually published a paper in the State Department, for the State Department, on forestry in Sweden and its possible application in the United States.
So he becomes one of the key players in this movement toward managing forests and the development of the Minnesota National Forest. And you know, something else we should touch on for a second, Newell. There were some pretty horrific events that preceded the creation of the Minnesota National Forest, particularly the 1894 Hinckley Fire, the Great Hinckley Fire, which to this day is still one of the biggest catastrophes in Minnesota history. Over 400 people killed. Tell us a word about that tragedy and how that impacted the development of the National Forest.
Well, at that time, up to that time, loggers cut trees and they left what's called slash, which are the trimmings and the branches.
And the stumps.
And the stumps just on the ground. And 1894 happened to be a very dry year, and it was in September, which is fire season. And someone started a fire somewhere near Hinckley. And
I think I heard once there was speculation that it was from sparks flying off from train wheels.
No, I
Not
think it
true?
was more
Something else?
More likely, I think it turned out to be a settler who was clearing his land and piling up the brush and burning it.
Set a fire that got out of control.
Locomotives did start fires. That's true too, but not this particular fire. Andrews had more or less prophesized a disaster like this was bound to happen sooner or later, and in fact was giving a speech to an organization in St. Paul only a couple of days before that happened. The fire happened, and as a result, the legislature was so shocked that the following year, 1895, they created the office of Chief Fire Warden, someone who could mobilize township officers to protect or put out fires or prevent fires. And Andrews was named as the chief fire warden.
And he becomes not only the first chief fire warden in the state, he later becomes the first state forester too, isn't that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So there are all these different dynamics that are at play in the creation of this Minnesota National Forest. And we should say to our viewers right now, it's now known today as Chippewa National Forest, which the name changed by Congress in 1928, was it? 28. So we know it today as the Chippewa National Forest. But so you have the landowner interests up there, you have timber interests, you have the women's groups, you have Native Americans. Say a word about the role of Native Americans in this debate.
Well, they were in some respects non-players. Native Americans were not citizens of the United States. They were considered wards of the government.
They didn't get citizenship until 1924.
23.
Yeah.
24.
Yeah.
So they had really no voice and no vote. But various groups were saying, well, we're doing this to try and resolve, make life better for the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota. Well, the problem at that point, among many in land management is that the laws were weak and easily evaded or broken and not enforced. And Senator Knute Nelson
who had been governor previously.
Had been governor and was now senator, had put in a bill that got passed, which restricted cutting of these pine lands on the reservation to dead and down timber as a way to try to protect the timber resource. Two things, something that didn't mention in the paper, but protecting the headwaters of the Mississippi River was very important to downstream interests, and which was why Itasca State Park was created, was to protect the headwaters. So not cutting all the pine was important to protecting the headwaters. However, the dead and down restriction made it easy for people who held plots of timber to set a fire, and suddenly you've got dead and down timber that can be cut.
So it seems like this Nelson law actually had unintended consequences, if
yes.
you will, that it was meant to preserve this allotment system he created, but it ends up actually threatening the trees and
well, there's several other things.
And you have all kinds of people presuming to speak for Native American people who live in northern Minnesota at this time too.
The so-called progressives at that time thought that the best thing that could happen to the indigenous people was to get them off the reservation and teach them farming and do what you could to integrate them into white society and get rid of the past in their culture. That they saw that as the culture as holding them back. Which today we certainly see that in another light, that is not the way. That was not just. So you had groups trying to find a solution to the dead and down in the timberland to help, as they thought they were doing, help the indigenous people get off the reservation and be absorbed into the larger society. So various proposals are being put forth, none of which have a majority of anybody behind them, until a Chicago sportsman decides that what Minnesota needed was a national park right smack on top of the reservation. In fact, he wanted about 4 million acres of national park, which would have pretty much blocked off most of.
And what did they end up getting? Cut to the chase. They didn't get 4 million acres.
No, they didn't. They got, in the end, 225,000 acres. Today, the Chippewa National Forest encompasses 1.6 million, which includes reservation and state and federal lands. It has 1,300 lakes and 3,000 historical and archaeological sites.
We should mention, too, that some of these forest park advocates, the early advocates, were trying to advance their argument to get the National Forest on the argument that the pine lands of northern Minnesota weren't really fit for agriculture. Wasn't this an argument that some of them made?
Well,
and how did this viewpoint help in the creation of the first National Forest?
Well, soil science was not well advanced at that point. Chapman, who was at that point in Grand Rapids at the head of an agricultural station, knew this. Pine lands tend to be acidic. The soils tend to be acidic, which are not good for crops. And they tend to be thinner, sandier soils, which exhaust quickly. The historic pattern had been to clear the hardwood forests, which are much more fertile, and crops follow in their wake. And that had been the history for 200 years. So when the settlement reaches the pine lands, no one has any idea that this is not going to work the same way. And so very quickly the crops are grown, and the first year or two they're pretty good, but they exhaust all the fertility in the soil after that. But ideas once set in motion are hard to change. And so the idea was that, plow follows the axe, and crops follow the plow. So there is that feeling that, and agriculture has a, excuse me, has a privileged place in American culture, in the American economy.
Very much so.
You know, it's a Jeffersonian idol, and so how could you not want people to settle the land?
Right. And it's also interesting to me when I read your paper, which, by the way, your paper is in the spring issue of the Minnesota Historical Society magazine. That's where I came across it and thought, I've got to get Newell on our show to talk about this. I think it's a fascinating chapter for Minnesota history because it's all these different disparate groups that have different attitudes and ideas about land use, about conservation, and ultimately, after 4 years of effort, they actually come to a point where this Minnesota National Forest is created in, what year was it, 1904, 1905?
It was created in 1902.
1902.
1902.
And this becomes sort of the template for the creation later of the Boundary Waters canoe area and other things that happened.
Exactly. No. The Boundary Waters was set aside by the presidential signature.
That's right. This was created by Congress.
This was the first national forest created by Congress.
Right.
And it was created basically inadvertently to resolve other problems of legislation, not purely for the idea of let's have a national forest. That wasn't the motive. The motive was let's resolve the dead and down Indian land issue, and this seems to be what everybody can agree on, so okay, we'll turn it into a national forest.
Now, interestingly, after the national forest is created, the town of Cass Lake, which is in the center of all of this activity, they were expecting an economic boom as a result of the national forest. They had been promised that, but apparently some business interests in the community and residents didn't feel that they were realizing that economic boom, and they did something very curious within, what was it, 1 or 2 years after the park or the forest was created. They did what?
I think they tried to get it overturned.
Abolished.
But once a law is passed, it's very hard to overturn it. And expectations were unrealistic. Promises were probably overplayed. And you had the boomer mentality. I mean, this happens. I mean, every frontier community in American history has this sort of expansionist boomer mentality. And if you look at the newspapers from here to Arizona in the 1870s when the silver boom was on, you read the same kinds of prophecies of how what you're seeing in front of you is better than anything that's ever been seen before. And so it goes. And newspapers keep the bubble alive until it bursts.
The creation of the Minnesota National Forest, Chippewa National Forest, seems significant to me when I read your article, because I thought you can hear echoes of some of these public policy debates from the late 19th, early 20th century, echoes of that debate that occurred in Minnesota during the very contentious debate about mixed use of the Boundary Waters canoe area, one of the largest wilderness areas in the continental United States, and allowing some of those lakes in the BWCA to be opened up to motorized use. And it became a hugely controversial issue in Minnesota. Many of us of a certain age, we remember 1978 very well. It affected state and federal elections. What lessons do you draw? We're down to about 2.5 minutes. What would you say some of the key lessons are you draw yourself from the creation, what it took to create the Minnesota National Forest, and what the implications are for our conservation legacy?
Well, one lesson you can draw from this is that deadlock inevitably produces a compromise to make something happen. And so whatever happens may not be what was intended, but something has to happen, and that's how you ended up with 225,000 acres of managed forest.
Right.
When you look at this story, you find that certain groups had an agenda that was even more basic than saving the forest. The Women's Federation was well on its way to learning the skills of politics that led to women finally getting the vote.
Which they didn't have at this time.
Which they didn't
They
have.
don't get until 1920 something.
But they were
Yeah.
very skillful.
Right.
You had the Forestry Bureau of Gifford Pinchot in Washington finally seeing an opportunity to get a forest it could manage, because up to that point it didn't have anything to manage. Andrews could see that a forest reserve in Minnesota was just good for Minnesota and the kinds of plans he had. Chapman had an opportunity to see scientific forestry practiced. No one heard much from the indigenous community about how they felt about it. You had some who said it was good, some who said it was bad, but they had no formal voice.
Yeah. I guess a lesson I drew from reading your paper, Newell, and I think, again, it's a fascinating subject in our history. Nothing happens unless people come together and compromise in the end, and this was an example of it. Newell Searle, author, historian, thank you for telling us a little bit about the history of the Chippewa National Forest and its legacy and Minnesota's conservation legacy, and we'd love to have you back on to talk further about some of these issues in the future. Thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
You're welcome. Thank you.